had the pleasure of working with.
Sorry, Jen, I just hit the record button there. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. I've had the pleasure of working with Steve for, I think it's been about 8 years now that we've been working together. And I can tell you that he has one of the most unique and uplifting perspectives on human behavior and what drives us. For those of you who have had the pleasure of hearing Steve talk before, you'll know exactly what I mean. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of hearing Steve speak, if this is your first time, I can assure you that it will be a great session for you. So with that, let me introduce Steve de Groot. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jen Hessen from Brivia Consulting. Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. Some technical difficulties off the bat. My headset crashed. I'm using a couple of different things, and the notes weren't working out. And now we are now recording, so we're all good. Thank you very much, Jen, for being here, and thanks everybody. To the beginning, we have 3 sessions. This is part of the "It Doesn't Have to Be This Hard" series, right? So some of our roles at work are hard enough, and also. We're still getting through this pandemic. So for all of those that are here, I hope that you're doing as well as possible, given these unpredictable, pervasive this pandemic. So please stay safe, and I hope we can get through this soon. Today we're talking about the conversation you've been avoiding, right? And we are all like the reality is we all avoid important conversations at times. As a matter of fact, many of us are doing it right now as we speak. Someone at work or someone in our life. And that's what we're going to talk about, whether it be a performance conversation or feedback of some sort, or for a variety of reasons. And unfortunately, when we put these conversations off, they get more difficult and they get way more complicated. Let me tell you what we're going to cover today. And by the way, as Jen was saying, please use the chat, use the Q&A function. We're going to get to the questions midway through and also towards the end. And stay on to the end if you can, because we've got some important information to share with you. So we're going to get into connecting with you. So if you've got a pen or a pencil or a scribe of some sort, I want you to jot down a couple of answers to the questions I'm going to ask you. I want to connect to what you really want for your people and for your teams. Then I'm going to start this off with a story. It's a real story. And then we're going to get into, why do we avoid conversations? Why do we even avoid the ones we know we're supposed to have? We're going to talk about what makes talks difficult. We're going to get into navigating what I call the intent impact gap, right? Sometimes small, sometimes large. We're going to get into why, from the ideal to the real, how do we manage expectations? And we're going to get into my favorite part, which is always practical strategies, key strategies to have confident conversations. Now, as I said, use the questions. There's going to be lots of questions. There might even be moments where you feel a little bit of guilt, maybe even a little bit of shame, and maybe even a bit of fear. But what we're going to replace that with is tons of hope and strategies towards better. So I want you to actually answer these 2 questions for yourself. You don't have to share them, but I want you to think about 2 very important questions. And I want you to write these down because they're going to be anchors throughout this session. The first question that I want you to answer is, what do you want for the people on your team? So whether you're a team member or a leader, I want you to just reflect right now, just scribble it down somewhere, because I want to gently hold us all accountable today and make what we're talking about easier. What do you want for the people on your team? Do you want them to trust you? Do you want them to perform better? Do you want them to grow? Do you want your team to be successful? Do you want them as individuals? So I want you to just jot down 1 or 2 answers to this questions of what you prefer, right? What do you want for the people on your team? Now, there's a second question, and I'm going to come back to this reflection. So if you have 1 or 2 answers written down, it will make your time with us more meaningful. Here comes the second question. What would you like the people on your team, what would you like their experience of you to be? I really want you to think about that. Do you want them to experience you as kind? Do you want them to experience you as supportive? Right? From your perspective, how would you like your people on your team, whether you're the leader or a team member, to experience you? Okay. This is critical because this is going to help make difficult conversations easier. And I'm going to drop it, I guarantee some of the stuff that we share with you, some of the things you're already doing, but we're going to make having difficult conversations less difficult and easy, if you could imagine. I want to start with a story. This is a real story. I want to tell you a story about a manager named Paul, who was in a mid-leadership position in several organizations over 15 years. Last year, Paul had learned that he was being experienced by many people in his company as arrogant, as indecisive, and as unkind. And this was very difficult for Paul. Very difficult for him to hear for two reasons. First reason is he found this out by accident from other people. Indirectly, no one had ever told him this before. Paul knew he wasn't perfect, but he didn't believe it. So he went to his boss, right? He went right to his boss, who confirmed that the people had been complaining about his behavior. And it was impacting many people in the company. And the news was really difficult for Paul, very difficult for him to hear, right? But it wasn't just the news that made it challenging. No one had ever told him this. According to his boss, his peers, and HR, who was there, it had been going on for 5 years. He had no idea that he was behaving or performing in a way that was incongruent with what he even wanted for himself and what he wanted for his team members. And no one even told him. No one talked to Paul about it. But here's the thing, they talked to a lot of other people. They talked to tons of people. People were having conversations, but they weren't having conversations with Paul, right? And there was a lot of confusion around his behaviors. There was trust issues. There was relationship issues. People were feeling bent, bruised, and broken along the way for a long time, and it felt like something was off. He knew something was off, but no one ever told him. The impact on the relationships and the teams, by the time someone told him, was massive. And the impact on Paul was devastating. And as a matter of fact, it was soul crushing. Upon interviewing Paul, I learned that this was not what he wanted. He was willing to do what he needed to do to change. When I talked to him, he said he didn't want to be perceived in this way, but no one told him. By the time he learned of this, it was too late. Paul was terminated. It's a sad story, and indeed, some people might be thinking that this is an extreme story. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to get back to Paul in a bit, right? And talk about how these stories, many of us can relate to parts of this story from just a little bit to a lot. And oddly enough, there is some really good news in this one, right? There's good news because his leaders and his team members, I'll tell you this, they did not want bad things. They wanted good things for Paul. They were not bad people, right? So if you have some questions about this, don't forget to put them in the Q&A. We're going to just amp up some of the situation. So from the beginning and over the years, they were just avoiding the conversations that they should be having with Paul. That was basically it, right? It is the story behind this and thousands of, well, hundreds for sure, variations of the story that was the impetus to this webinar for this very one, right? It shouldn't have to be this hard. It doesn't have to be this hard. Every single week, we talk to people who have concern with someone about their behavior, about their performance, but they're not talking to that person. They range from minor but aggravating to serious situations that are impacting others. See, we have to do something about this because as team members and leaders, it costs a lot in efficiency, it costs a lot in lost productivity, and among many other things, it costs, but mostly when we don't have the conversations that we need to be having, it causes confusion, conflict, and unnecessary human carnage. Here's the reality, right? The reality is that all of us, right? All of us are avoiding conversations that we need to have. Okay, with someone about something. It's about behavior, it's about their performance, right? Something we're concerned about, and for a variety of reasons, which we're going to get into, right? We're not having the conversation with the person that we need to have it. Now, actually, this is something that's a little bit inaccurate because I'm saying we're not having conversations. We are having conversations. We're having conversations with everybody about this. We're having it with the wrong people. We're not speaking with the person we need to be speaking with. And this is where we start to drift. This is where the wrong things are set in motion. Our experience is that nothing good comes from not having that conversation. Absolutely nothing. There's damage, and it's going to happen. Damage is going to come. This is what we've learned from our work with many companies and thousands of people, is that the damage is going to come. We don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know in what level, but it will come. As team members, we have a role to support people's on our team. Like we have a responsibility to give them feedback. And as leaders, it's to have the conversation about things that we're concerned about is a fundamental responsibility. It's not whether we should have it or not. It's when we should have it and how we should have it. So let's talk about the big reasons why we avoid, because if we all know, so if you're feeling, this is going to get much better. If you're feeling any guilt or shame or fear, it's going to dissipate as we go on. There's two big reasons why we don't have the conversation, right? There's two big reasons we avoid. The first one, right, The first one for sure is that we don't want to hurt them. We don't want to upset them, right? Reason number two is we don't have the conversation because it's uncomfortable. Now I want to back up to these really important things. Let's go to the first one, right? All of you are good people. Everyone here is a good person, right? The first reason that we don't share is because we care and we don't want to hurt people's feelings. We don't want to upset them in any way. It comes from a really good place, and we can all take comfort in this. But after a while, something unintended and something unfortunate happens, right? We start to slide a little bit. It starts to become more about us. It starts to become, well, maybe I'm not going to have this conversation with Paul because I'm uncomfortable. Now, I know the word is harsh, but we call that cowardice, right? Gently, we call that word cowardice. It's too uncomfortable for us, right? And many of us will slide. So sometimes we go from caring and then we go to cowardice, and we'll slide back and forth. And there's many things that we tell ourselves. And some of those things that we tell ourselves, we have many reasons, like tons of reasons. It's not the right timing. I'm not sure if it's going to hurt their feelings. I'm not sure if it's going to impact the team. And some of those are really convincing reasons, right? But we're all somewhere on this caring cowardice continuum. And the reality is that most of us slide from one end to the other. And here's what's really important, right? Another reality, as we said this, is you have good intentions, right? But our intentions matter very little. Whether I'm operating from caring or whether I'm operating from cowardice, the impact is exactly the same. Somewhere in between, there will be damage, there will be conflict, there will be carnage. And sometimes, like I said, it's a little bit, and sometimes it's a lot. So we call this the caring cowardice continuum, right? And I know there's some people on the line that know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't worry, I'm not talking just about you. We use this in a lot of our work with leaders, right? When we talk about why we're not having the conversation. The good news is, as we were talking about, is the intentions. Let's focus on the good news. Let's focus on the intent, right? Nobody wants this. Go back to your questions in the chat, okay? Right? I want everybody to go back to that first question, okay? What do you want for your people? I want you to connect with that answer, because I'm going to ask you to put something in the chat right away. And thanks for using the chat, everyone, because I want to see the chat. I'm seeing people are here from Sudbury. I'm seeing Winnipeg, Tampa Bay. I know there's some people from New York. Here we go. I'm going to ask you this question, and I want a yes or no answer in the chat. When you look at your answers to those two questions, what you want for your team and how you want to be perceived by the people you work with, okay? Here comes the question. If people were experiencing your behavior in a way that was incongruent with those answers, with what you want, with how you want to be perceived, or your behavior was frustrating, or maybe it was upsetting to your peers, to your team, or to the people that you care about, would you want to know? Yes or no? Would you want to know? My gosh, look at Amy, Jody, Laura, Lori, Kristen, Brenda. Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay, wow. Okay, here comes the good news. Jeff, yes, absolutely. Paul, Rachel, Carrie, Sherry. Here's the good news. You want good things. And here comes the other thing. We have 160 people on the line. I have asked this same question to over 10,000 people, and that is not an underestimate. Everyone says yes. Do you know something? If I would have asked Paul 5 years ago, I'm going to try not to get emotional to this because I got to know this guy. They didn't just judge his behavior, they started to judge his character. If somebody asked Paul 5 years ago, would you want to know? Why would he argue with anyone? He would answer like all 10,000 people and all people here. He would have said yes. See, Paul didn't want this either, right? So the goal becomes now, how do we bridge, or how do we somehow zap that gap that exists between our intentions and our impact? And we've got some answers here, okay? And we're going to open it up, and I see there might be some questions. So let's get to this, and thank you for answering that. This is what's wild to me, right? You want to know if your behavior is incongruent. I want to tell you, right? So what makes difficult conversations difficult? Because let's be honest, I don't want to minimize how difficult it is. The first one is that many of us, due to our past experiences, have been either experienced conflict or feedback in a way that's been negative or that has hurt us in some way. Many of us have either experienced or been taught to approach situations where there's a disagreement or where there needs to be feedback or conflict, either with silence or with violence, and very rarely in between. We either go silent and go quiet, or we get aggressive, right? Leading to damaging or destructive consequences. This is why many of us are uncertain, why many of us lack that trust in ourselves, in the situation, in the other person, right? And back to that caring cowardice continuum, because we all start from caring. There's a second one. There's a second reason why having difficult discussions is really hard. And that's because we've been avoiding them for so long. Upon my investigation around Paul, I went back to 2 of his other workplaces. They said the same thing. Nobody has been saying, sometimes we let these conversations, we avoid these conversations for so long that they become bigger, right? That they become hard and they become heavy. It's concerning behavior. So it starts with that, I'm concerned, then a simple set of subsequent avoidances, and then it grows. And in many situations, we not only start to avoid the conversation, we actually start taking steps. We start taking steps to avoid conversation, major steps to actually work around it, around the person or around the situation, and it gets really complicated. The disconnection, the avoidance, the confusion, the potential for damage becomes inevitable, right? We've actually been using this analogy of a speeding train, right? But the longer that train goes, if you're familiar with Newton in any way, you remember Newton, not Fig Newton, but Newton, right? That the force is equal to mass times acceleration. And this is something that's so critical, that the longer it goes, the stronger it grows, right? It's phenomenal. But here's something that we've learned. This is where the good news keeps coming. Here it comes. No matter how difficult you feel having a conversation is, no matter how difficult, how big, how bad, how ugly, how heavy it feels, here comes the reality. It will never be easier than right now. Nothing good comes from waiting, right? It'll never get any easier, right? So this is the big paradox, right? Because when you say you got to say something, like I can't. Waiting isn't going to make it easier. This moment right now, right? From the beginning, right? From the beginning, it's easier in the moment. And this is one of the things, right? Paul, like the hundreds of people we've talked to, is there a sting there when we give them feedback? We're going to talk about how to give them feedback, how to have the conversation. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So we got to do it right now. How do you stop a speeding train? Right? This is one of those things that trying to hold back my emotion, because the people that have gotten feedback late in the game, after the conflict that happened or the confusion and the carnage, we talk about stopping that speeding train. So, we have a research group with a bunch of quantum physicists and stuff. When we say, how do you stop a speeding train? Their answer is something like the speed is directly proportional or inversely proportional to the friction coefficient. But that's not what we're talking about. How can you stop a speeding train? You get it before it leaves the station. How do you get it before it leaves the station? Is as soon as you know or notice an incongruence between what somebody wants and how they're behaving is the moment it's in the station. And we have to have that conversation, because the train picks up speed and it will come back. As I said, that train gets set in motion. And some of us forget of it. We go days, months, weeks, and even years without even thinking about it, but the train is still in motion, and the faster it goes, the stronger it grows, and it is coming back at some point and sometime. So let's get into the strategies. How can we make difficult conversations less difficult and maybe even easier, as I would like to say? I haven't had a difficult conversation for years. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not nervous about them, excited about them. I think about them a lot, but they're much easier, right? So we refer to ease as 3 things: capacity, capability, confidence. Here comes the good news. Everybody has the capacity. Every single person on this call, every human being is built with the capacity to have conversations. Now, capability is a bit different. This is about having the strategies, and learning, finding the ones that work. The good news is that confidence comes from two places. One, successes. So the more you have them, the easier it gets. And it comes from trust. Because as you experience success and you start to see that it isn't as hard, it doesn't have to be as hard as it is, you start to trust yourself, you start to trust the other person, and you start to trust the situation. So let's get into the strategies, and then we're going to open it up to questions. Okay, so I'm going to grab my notes. We're going to 12:45 today, right? So we're going to get into these strategies. Here are the specific concrete strategies. Now we're recording this, so if I go over something, there's lots here, but before I get into this, I want to just state, if you are wanting to have better conversations, less conflict, greater efficiency and productivity in every single interaction, just give us a call, because I want to say, these are the strategies that I'm pulling out now. We've pulled them out of the two programs that we have: core communication for business, which I think is pound for pound the best communication, one-day communication training on the planet, and responsive practice and responsive communication for the human services. So that's where some of this stuff comes from, but this is being recorded, so you can watch it again. Strategy number one, and I've grabbed my notes because I don't want to miss a thing here, is that as soon as you notice a behavior that you're concerned with to any degree, right, we call that incongruence. We look for incongruences, right? We connect with intent. And what I mean is our intent first. Connect with your intent. I want good things. I want good things for them. I want them to succeed. And also connect with their intent. Remember, thousands of people that we are concerned with want good things also. And acknowledge that you don't know what their experience is. You can all, because if you assume their intentions, right? And you have to be cautious if you think you know this person. Because if you think you know them well, you're going to be on the wrong foot. You're going to be susceptible to creating a narrative that's not true. I don't want to give you the statistics of how many times we've investigated a situation right down to the detail, and I'm just going to give it a high percentage. We were wrong. Even the people closest to the person were wrong. That's why I'm so passionate about this, because it's about eliminating unnecessary suffering, okay? So that's what we do. We connect with the intent. They want good things. We want good things. This is going to set us up for success. The second one is ask the billion-dollar question. Now, some of you have heard this. When we do the follow-up with the link to the video, we'll send you a link to the billion-dollar question video. It's 11 minutes long, but here it comes. If you want to write it down, the billion-dollar question is this. If I see Jeff or Laura or Mike or Jeff, or there's so many Jeffs and Lauras on the line, behaving in a way that's concerning, I asked myself the billion-dollar question was, what do I know about this from their perspective, right? What do I know about this? Insert their behavior, talking over people, interrupting, coming late when they said they're going to be on time. What do I know about that behavior from their perspective? The answer is always nothing. Now, why is that important? Well, what I think affects how I feel determines how I act. So if I think that Jeff is lying to me, I'm going to feel frustrated, aggravated, maybe even vengeful. And how am I going to behave? It is not going to be successful. So the question is, what do you know about this? And that's the behavior from their perspective. Now, the neat thing about from their perspective is we can't answer it without them, okay? And if we try to answer it, we're going to develop a narrative that is probably wrong and are going to a little bit or to a lot complicate the situation. So where do we go from there? This is one of my favorite ones. I like them all. But when you set up the conversation, set it up under these two messages, right? Mike, I want to talk to you about how you're doing at work in an email or in person, but it's for two reasons. Mike, I care about you as a person and as an employee. And second, I care about your success. I have some feedback for you that will help you with that. So that's how you set up the conversation. It's about connecting, supporting, and developing in the two messages. I care about you and I care about your success. I have not met anybody that's freaked out and said, Steve, and then went off on me because I cared about them and cared about their success, right? So here comes the next one, and I'm reading my notes. Forgive me if I'm looking down. Connect with them on their perspective. This is really important. When Mike comes to the office to see me or tunes into an MS Teams meeting or whatever, however we're going to connect over the phone, I want to hear from him first. Let's pick any behavior, speaking over people in meetings, right? Maybe it's coming late. Maybe it's aggressive. You insert any behavior that you're concerned about, right? Before you get into what you see, before you get into the judgments and the assumptions and all those things, you ask them about the situation. I would say, hey, Mike, thanks for talking to me today. We haven't connected for a while. I really wanted to hear about your perspective on the team meetings that we've been having. Tell me about the meetings from your perspective. Mike, before we get into what I'm noticing, I want to ask you, what are you hoping for in team meetings? What is it that you want in team meetings? Like, what are you hoping for and what's most important to you? See, I start to listen for this and all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I guarantee you I'm learning something, but I'm also a bit confused because there's some incongruences, and that's okay. But what's so good is by giving them their perspective first, they feel safe, they feel significant, they feel situated. You've heard that before, and they're going to be honest with us about what's important to them. Now, we should have done this already, right? I'm just going to chime in and say, if this is the first time I'm asking Mike about what's important, and I just need to just pause for a second and say that. We are talking about this process when we're in a situation where we need to talk about someone's behavior, but hopefully connecting on Mike's experience happened before this, like started on his first week, right? And the meetings before this. So the other thing I'm going to mention is one of the things we talk about is stay curious, right? Stay curious about Mike's intentions and what he's hoping for. Then here comes the next step. Now it's time for me to share my observation. Thanks, Mike, for sharing that. It sounds to me that you want the team to feel your passion, right? And really get your point. I think that's awesome, Mike. One of the things I'm seeing is that sometimes you cut people off while they're talking to really make your point. And I'm wondering, right, as sharing the observation, because this observation isn't judgment, it's not interpretation, it's not, right, an assumption. It is I'm telling Mike in a respectful and dignified way what I'm seeing. And I'm leaving all sorts of opening for him to correct me, to say, that's not my intention, Steve. And this is what usually happens, right? Mike would say, oh my God, really? I'm cutting people off? That's not what I want. I actually want them to engage and buy in. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about that together. How can I support your success, right? When I share my observation, here's the good news, the conversation will be good learning for both of us. But here, let's be real. Does it sting? Will Mike feel the sting? Will Laura feel the sting? Will Pam feel the sting? Will Jeff feel the sting from the feedback? Yeah, do you know why it stings? Go back to what you want for each other. Go back what you want for the team. It would have stung Paul. I'll tell you this right now. I'll tell you this. I'm dealing with more than 10 situations right now where people are standing around going, who's going to tell her? Like, who's going to tell her? We have a physician who has never been told that their behavior in a hospital setting in some part of Canada is having a negative impact. Nobody has told this person for close to 12 years. Now it's an issue. And now someone's going to say, now you know what they're doing? They're all like pulling straws. We know who's going to go in, but who's going to do it? Like, remember stepping in front of that speeding train? What makes this moment so hard is that the 100 of people that were there before us did not have this conversation. Now think about this. Imagine we did this. We shared our observation when Dr. Myers was in her residency. That's not her real name. And said, hey, can I talk to you for a second? She said, yeah. And I said, what's important to you on your team? And she probably says what most of you wrote down at the beginning of this thing. And I said, hey, yelling at people and throwing, some of your things around, just post-surgery is probably not helpful for the team. Right? That day, not 22 years or 15 years or 9 years ago or whatever, like in the moment, would it have stung her? Absolutely. But it would have given her an opportunity to change her behavior. Here comes the most important one of all of these. Make feedback meaningful. Now, how do you do that? Feedback, make it meaningful. Now, I'm going to give you a really, really concrete example. I want you to look at your answers that you wrote down in the beginning. And if you weren't here in the very beginning, I want you to think about what you want for your team members and how you want to be perceived. I want you to connect with that. Because if I was coaching you, right, if I was coaching you and someone said to me, Steve, go talk to Laura, go talk to Chris, go talk to Pam, go talk to Jeff about their behavior. Before I did that, I would ask I would get to know about your needs, values, goals, and strengths. We call that core 4. Why? Well, let's just say that some of you wrote down strengthen relationships, get them to trust me, and for them to be to work really well together. Okay, so maybe that's what you wrote down. I would ask you, I would say, hey, Mike, hey, Jeff, what do you want for your team? And this is, you would say, Steve, I want them to succeed. I want them to trust me. I want them to get along. And I would say, that is awesome. That's great. And you might say, why? And I said, well, I've got some feedback for you that can help you get there faster. I've actually got some feedback that I heard that I think would be helpful to strengthen trust, to get them to work better together. See, now, why is this important? This meaning is going to buffer the sting somewhat. It's going to hold you because you see the value in taking this feedback because it's meaningful. But if I called you into the office or set up a Teams meeting and I said, hey, people are saying this, they're saying this, they're saying this, it is not meaningful. It is an ambush. You are not feeling safe. You're feeling closed. And all you want to do is get out. You don't want to get open. You want to get closed and just get out of this situation. So by making the feedback meaningful, and I've given feedback to some really tough situations, like to prisoners when you have to tell them that they're not going to get out when they want to get out. And you've got to deliver that feedback. And the other two people that went in before you have been hospitalized. Okay, it's not a fairy tale. The only way you're going to be able to get that feedback through to this person, whether it's a prisoner, whether it's a loved one in your relationships, whether it's a team member, whether it's a co-leader, is to make it meaningful. And the more you know about what they need for themselves and their team, the more you know about their values and what's important and what they're hoping for their success, the more you know about their strengths, you can make almost any piece of feedback meaningful. Okay. Finally, before we get to questions, clarify and reset expectations. Most incongruences are out of their awareness. Most incongruences are a result of not knowing clearly what was expected of them, right? Not only in terms of their role and their function, but how they should be with each other in team meetings and one-on-one with clients, with each other, right? It's around the behavior, yes, but more importantly, you have to how do we make conversations going forward more meaningful, right? Because this is not going to be the only time, right? Pam and Laura and Jeff, there's going to be another time where I'm going to witness an incongruence. That we're human. We all have blind spots, right? Clarifying and resetting expectations are all, hey, Mike, what can we do the next time this happens? What do I need to know about approaching you in a way that makes it more meaningful? Because you already know that I want your success and I care about you. And I already know that you want to show up every single day to do really good things. So let's keep it there. How do we approach times when I'm feeling I'm concerned or confused about how you're behaving? And we let it ride and we do it. So one of the things I'm going to suggest is start today. Start small with one of those minor but aggravating things. We cannot, and I say it's this generation of leaders, and it doesn't matter whether you're 80 years old or 14. I mean, this generation currently right now, one of the biggest tasks we have is to stop letting those trains pick up speed. Stop letting the BS, ferment, and start having those conversations so that the leaders that come behind us can do it with much more ease, with much more productivity, efficiency, and less human carnage, because it doesn't have to be this hard, right? It doesn't have to be this hard. So let's open it up for questions. I wanna hear. We've got about 9 minutes left, right? And I know there's lots of people here. There's lots in the chat. I know, Jen, if you're there, if you want to come back on and maybe help me out with some of the questions.
Sure. Yeah, so lots of great discussion happening in the chat and some questions coming in. So Steve, you've talked about, how to give feedback and, what the conditions are to make it meaningful. Is there ever situations or a situation you can think of when you just shouldn't be giving somebody feedback?
It's probably less than 1% of the time. When do you not give feedback? Well, there's two situations. One is if it doesn't concern you. So that's the first one. So the one time you shouldn't give feedback, there's 3 questions that you can ask yourself is what's the concern? How is this a concern, and who is it a concern for? Because sometimes we're concerned about things that aren't our responsibility and they're not in our wheelhouse. And I call those minor but aggravating, right? So it's more stylistic, right? So once we assess those 3 questions, we can decide, okay, we don't really need to have this conversation. That could lighten the load a bit. The second time, which happens less than 1% of the time, is if the feedback is going to create a violent situation or a serious situation where somebody might be emotionally, mostly physically hurt. Then you've got to set it up a different way. But that rarely, if ever, happens. So my answer leads mostly towards no. If you're responsible for their development, their well-being, we must have the conversation that we've been avoiding. Yeah.
All right. And just maybe following on that a little bit, what about like, how do you manage or how do you deal with situations maybe where the person that you're needing to give the feedback to, and you know it's going to be maybe a conversation that will sting, and they're perhaps under some, lots of stress or maybe some things happening, whether it's at work or in their personal life. So you know that they're already under some stress. What do you do in those situations? How do you manage the feedback in those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And undoubtedly that makes it more difficult, right? They're moving, they just had a baby, they had a divorce, the pandemic. I mean, we've got to be careful though. I think it's really important. Timing is important and how we do it is important. But we got to be careful. Remember the caring cowardice continuum, right? Many of us, I've heard 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't have the conversation. And many of them more lean towards us because we're uncomfortable. If there are serious situations where there's a family issue, yes, we don't need to tell them right now. If this is not going to immediately impact anybody, right? Like if it's not an emergency, we should use our discretion. Should we wait a week? Should we put some supports in place? Do we need to have this conversation now, right? So absolutely, it's important to take those things into consideration. But have the conversation as soon as possible. That's the really big point here.
Right. And what about those situations where maybe you're receiving some feedback, people are coming to you talking about behaviors of somebody else that's maybe under your leadership, but you haven't observed those behaviors. You're sort of hearing these rumblings. What do you do when it's, not observable behavior?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. That is an amazing question. What do you do if the behavior that someone comes to you with is concerning? Now, this is tricky, but I've got some great techniques for this. Now, Jen and I have been working together for years, and we've had a lot of that where people come up to us and say, hey, there's a behavior that's impacting us. My first question is the person that has come to me is those three questions. What is the concern? How is it a concern? And who is it a problem for? Because often it's a problem just for the person coming to talk to me. It's not a problem for anybody else. So that's really important to figure out before we move on that. Okay, that's step number one. Step number two is I ask them, what were you hoping for by bringing this to me? Okay, I want to know what's really driving this. Is this impacting other people? Is it impacting our customers? Or what's really behind this? Okay, so that's the second thing, right? The third thing is if it seems like this is a legitimate concern, I'm going to ask them if they have given the other person feedback yet, right? So how is it affecting you? And if it's affecting you, have you given them feedback? Now, if they say, no, I haven't, I get back to that other question. What were you hoping for by coming to me? And here comes the final question before we do anything at all. Would you like to do something about this? Sometimes people say, no, Steve, I'm just getting it off my chest. I'm like, wow, that's good before we set this in motion. Sometimes they say, yeah, and then it becomes, well, how do we do this? Can you go back on your own and give them feedback? If they say no, I say, well, you like me to facilitate that with you together, right? Rarely do I go on my own unless I've observed the behavior or there's concrete evidence that there's a problem, okay? That was a long answer. You might have to rewind that one to get those steps, but those are the steps that we use in those very, very difficult situations.
Great. This is a really great question and something I can definitely relate to myself. What about when we find ourselves in a situation as a leader, maybe, we've been supervising somebody for years and we're acknowledging now that we've actually been avoiding some conversations and some necessary conversations with individuals. So now the behavior has been, going on maybe for a number of years, we haven't really addressed it. How do you start? Like, how do you actually approach that person in a way that you can start that conversation?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you're human, you've had this experience, right? Every single one of us have avoided conversations that we should have been having. Sometimes it's a little, sometimes it's a lot. Sometimes we hope things change. Unfortunately, some people either leave or get performance developed out, and that's a whole. We're gonna talk about that in the next webinar, I think. So I'm gonna give you some information on that. When you're dealing with this one, own it. We have to own it. it's not, remember, it's not going to get easier than this moment. I mean, it would be good to kind of connect with ourselves and reflect on what were the reasons that we did, but own it. I mean, I would go back to you, Jen, and I say, we got to set up, I would talk about your strengths. I would talk about all the great things. I would start there and then say, I have a confession to make, right? And I need to own this. I need to acknowledge it. I need to apologize, and I need to act on it. How can we make this better? The interesting thing is most people feel when we haven't been honest with them or other people haven't been. For many people, it's a relief. They've sensed it. And yes, does it sting? Yes, absolutely. But as I said, if there's some consolation in knowing why we should start as soon as we get off this call, is to know that it won't get any easier than now, right? So even if you wait another day, it's going to get harder. So own it, acknowledge it, affirm their experience, apologize, and act on it. Okay.
Okay, I'm just watching the time. I realize we're almost at the top of time. I don't know if you have
Okay.
anything you want to close with, Steve.
I want to tell everybody what's happening next. And I wanted to say thank you so much, everybody, for being here and asking these questions. And this is one of the most difficult things in the world. It doesn't have to be this hard, right? So I'm hoping that it was helpful. I'm grateful that you were here and that you trust us enough to join us each time. I want to bring your attention. We are going to continue the It Doesn't Have to Be This Hard series. And the next one we're going to be talking about is the performance conversation. So in about a month, we are going to be doing another 45-minute webinar called The Performance Conversation about why they're so important. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And most importantly, we're going to talk about how focusing on problems can make the performance conversation worse and why discipline shouldn't hurt. And that discipline and performance development are not necessarily the same thing. We're going to give like the perfect performance framework. So I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to thank Jen Hessen, who many of you haven't met yet. She's a wonderful Brivia consulting team member. And I wanted to thank all of you. And remember, we're here to help. We are here to help. We're really good at it. And it doesn't have to be that hard. So thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe. I wish you all the best on your way getting to better with the people that you're responsible for. And be well, be safe through this pandemic. Take care, everybody. And thank you, Jen, very much for helping me out today. I love hanging out with you and being here. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. We'll close it in about a minute. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Lovely messages in the chat. Thanks, everybody. Be well.